Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started here. I know there's still people coming in, but we'll get started. I want to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish Nation. I'm really excited to have Tasia here for our talk. A little bit about Tasia. She is the first female and African Nova Scotian technical director and performance coach for Basketball Nova Scotia. She is a Lakehead University graduate where she played basketball. She is a chartered professional coach, which I know is a big role or accreditation. And in addition to all of her coaching, she is also working closely with the North American Indigenous Games Committee to help prepare for the 2021 Games, which will be held in Nova Scotia. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really excited. As you mentioned, with NAG not being this year and being rescheduled for next year, it gives everyone a bit of a chance to even ramp up the excitement. So I know they just did a bit of a virtual games this past week, and the turnout was really great across all of North America. So that was wonderful. So right off the bat, my pronouns are she and her. And I am on Mi'kmaq territory here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's where I was born and raised. As Amy indicated, I did go to university out in Thunder Bay, Ontario, out in Lakehead. So it was nice and cold during the winters for anyone who wasn't overly familiar with being out there. So I'm really excited to be a part of I guess the whole week. There's just some really wonderful presenters, and I hope that everyone has a chance to jump in and learn from different people across the country. And if you can't tune in live, I know that everything's being recorded and posted to a YouTube channel if I'm correct. So I know I'll be tuning into a couple different ones after the fact. I'm gonna give a quality shout out to my mom, who has yet to miss any one of these chats that I've been a part of. She usually does make a cameo into these sessions. So Liz, at any point, if you want to run up and say hi, you're more than welcome to. I always encourage it. And I got to say hi to Winta, who also went to Lakehead University with me, and she was on a panel that we held with Basketball Nova Scotia, which was called A Challenging Conversation. And it was around having those discussions around working with our Black athletes and Black coaches. So if anyone ever wanted to check that out, that's on Basketball Nova Scotia's YouTube channel as well. And then the last thing before I get started, as you can see, the Black Canadian Coaches Association is the non-for-profit cause that I'm supporting for this event. It's something that was just announced last Friday, I believe, and it's we're working on developing a charter in support of our Black and Indigenous athletes and coaches, along with administrators across the country at a USport and a college level. So I'm really excited to be a part of that. It's something that I've never done before, and I obviously hasn't been done across the country. So again, that's the group that I'm supporting, and I hope everyone has a chance to check out their website whenever you have a moment. So I'm going to do a fancy screen share. Yes, we're going to continue. And we'll go right into present. Hopefully this works. I like to think that it does. So without further ado, we'll get started. So my topic is called Be a Standout When You Already Stand Out. The background picture is something I'm very proud of. It was my my time coaching as the head coach of our Women's Canada Games team in 2017, which was a huge accomplishment for me. It was something that I always wanted to do when I was an athlete in 2005, and then again as an assistant coach in 2013. And I really had my focus set on becoming the head coach of that team. And so I'm just really proud of that. I know I've coached at some higher levels through USport and been part of our St. Mary's women's basketball team, in which I had the privilege of being a part of teams that have won AUS championships and a bronze medal at a USport championship. But in terms of something that I'm most proud of in my coaching career, it will definitely be this Canada Games team. And I'm excited to be a part of it. Hopefully again next year is more of an administrative side. And the individual over my shoulder, I guess, kind of behind me, is Ayanna Empringham, who is our Aboriginal apprentice coach for the Canada Games team. So it's really neat to see that come full circle and know that, you know, she's following a bit of a path from being an athlete and moving on to being in a coaching role for that. So my next slide is, it's two pictures, and I'm in both the pictures, and we're going to have a fun little game, which I like to say, where's Tasia? And we'll go with how quickly can you find me in one picture, and then compared to another picture. So I don't know how we can possibly respond in that. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time, and if I can't see any responses, which is possible that I can't, we'll just continue on from there. So here are two pictures of two teams that I played for growing up. Obviously, they look very different. Both teams I thoroughly enjoyed playing on, but my experience would be different in both settings. So I'll give everyone like a minute or two to take a gander. So it's probably safe to say that in the picture on, I believe, everyone's right-hand side of the screen, you can probably easily spot me in the second row, furthest on the right. And the only other person that you'd probably guess is me would be the lovely lady to the left, who happens to be my mom. She just happens to be a darker shade than I am. And then over on the left-hand side is one of the very first basketball teams that I played for with the Community Y, in which I clearly look like almost everyone else on the team, except for number 21, who happens to be white. So I realize that we aren't playing any guessing games at that point, but I'm the one with the Raptors hat on. Go Raptors, they're still the NBA champions. But I would go out on a limb and say that it was probably a little bit more challenging to find me in the picture on the left than the picture on the right. And the reason that I wanted to share that was because these are two experiences that I can live in and function in. But the one on the right is one that I experience more, and even more so from the space of, oftentimes it is a group of males, particularly when we're thinking about the space that I'm in, which is in coaching. So I just like to make note of the fact that depending on who I am around, and even for anyone else, depending on who you're around, can change the entire outlook of who that person is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the iceberg model that I think is important to share, because when we're talking about being a Black female in a coaching position, or even as an athlete, a lot of times when I walk into a space, those are the two things that are the easily identifiable for me, because of the limited number of females in a coaching position, the limited number of Black people in a coaching position, and then combine the limited number of Black women in a coaching position. So I know that when I walk into certain gyms, whether it's a coaching course, whether I'm working in a tournament, whether I'm coaching in a tournament, or even when I was a player, that was the first thing that people always saw, was the color of my skin and my perceived gender, which I very clearly dress on the more feminine side. So what happens in those situations is a little bit of this. So there's our stereotypes that are around for almost everyone, I would say, in some way, shape, or form. But unfortunately, a lot of times the stereotype for Black people and females in a coaching realm can be quite negative. So depending on the space I'm in, I can live in any one of these worlds. So if I'm in a room, let's say, with predominantly white females, there can be the stereotype of this Black person is going to be loud, angry, the exception. So a lot of times people would look at that picture of me playing with my Osprey team where I was the exception to the rule. I was just living in a different space, or a different type of Black, which is really an overwhelming concept to deal with. I could be viewed as unintelligent, rude, ignorant, ghetto, inarticulate, and sometimes too masculine. If we talk about Serena Williams and her body shape, when we're looking at her as a tennis player, a lot of times because of how she's built, it can be viewed as too masculine, and therefore not considered a female. So then when we flip to the other side, females can be viewed as weak, belongs in the kitchen. If anyone follows, well, I'm sure almost everyone on here follows a lot of different sporting social media. When for me, if I follow the WNBA, there's a lot of talk around when the WNBA starts playing that they're no good, go make me a sandwich, get back in the kitchen, which is, it's disheartening to read. We can be viewed as inexperienced, reserved, have an inability to lead, too emotional, not competitive, dependent, or too feminine. So if I were to show up coaching like I would at St. Mary's, which is dressed in more of a business style, so in heels and a blazer and dress pants, or if I even show up wearing like a pink blazer, it can be viewed as a little bit too feminine. And then somewhere within all of that, I get the overlap of both of those things. So if I'm in a room with all white females, the thing that usually sticks out isn't my gender, it is the color of my skin. So I usually fall into those stereotypes. If I'm in a room where it's all Black men and then me, my race doesn't stand out, it's my gender that stands out, so I can possibly fall into that category. If I'm in a space where it's predominantly white males, both being Black and female are then going to coexist. And then if I'm in a room full of all Black females, they almost disappear. So it's fairly rare. And then all of a sudden, instead of being an individual in that space, I get grouped in as a whole. So if we look back at our Community Y team that I had shown, I'm suddenly not the individual, I'm the group. So when my team moves into a space in which we're playing a basketball game against maybe a predominantly white basketball team, we suddenly encompass all of these things as a whole instead of just me as an individual. So what happens in almost all of these settings, the assumption as a coach, or the assumption when I walk in a space isn't that I'm the head coach, it's that I'm an assistant, a manager, a relative, an athlete, or the girlfriend, wife, or partner of whomever the head coach is. So it's very rare that I walk into a gym and someone walks over and knows I'm the head coach, unless there's someone that knows me. And then the last one is becoming the advocate for all. So I don't know how many people on our call have been in that space, but a lot of times when we talk about diversity, we think having just one of that person is good enough. So if we have one female, that's diverse. If we have one Black person, that's diverse. If we have one person a part of the LGBTQ population, that's diverse. If we have one Indigenous person, that's diverse. And it's important to make note that that isn't diversity, that's just one person. And what happens is we get put in a space where we then need to advocate for all. So if I'm in a space where I'm the only Black female, when we start talking about something around gender or around Black specifically, not just race, but the Black race, or the Black women, all eyes get shifted to me, and I suddenly become the person that has to speak on behalf of everyone, which is not fair to me, and it's not fair to everyone else who is a part of my community, because not only am I a Black female, but there's so many other pieces to me, which tailors back to that iceberg concept, in that, yes, you see little bits and pieces, but we're not looking at where I live, my class, my education, what I do for a job, and all of those are other things that are different from another Black female who happens to also be a coach. So I just like to keep that in mind, which is deemed they're coined the term intersectionality, which is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's talking about how essentially two different traits can be deemed as perhaps a little bit more negative, and when they combine, there's a cross section where those things meet. And for me, it's being a Black female. So my question to all of us, and I know we're not in a bit of an interactive place, I'm not sure how to make that happen, but how many of us, is just a time to reflect on our own, have visual traits that we would assume puts us at a disadvantage? And as I mentioned, there are a lot of different examples, and it's time for us on our own to reflect in that space, and just understanding that I don't think it's something that we think about and that we discuss enough. And then when we look at it as to how we coach our athletes, do we reflect on who they are at the tip of that iceberg and then take the time to figure out who they are below that? So I'll move on to the next slide, but I just wanted to add a bit of a reflection piece in there, and I have that throughout the conversation as well. So understanding that we have athletes that have traits that we can see that put them at a disadvantage in terms of how society might view them, and that it's our job as a coach to understand those spaces, because a lot of times we always talk about as when we're coaching athletes that we put them as people first before athletes, and I think this is something that we don't quite talk about enough. So then with all of that comes the pressure. So for me, anytime that I started coaching was nerve-wracking. So anyone that's on the line that has been a coach in their very first coaching position or the game, it's can be terrifying. I think we all put on a bit of a brave face, but at the same time, we know that all eyes are on us. This is their first time coaching. Like, I hope we pick the right person. And for anyone who has, again, that outward trait that people can see, there's a little bit more added pressure, because if we are unsuccessful in that role, a lot of times it doesn't become, well, they were trying to do the right things, they just need a little bit more support around maybe the X's and O's. Everything looked really good, they just needed help with substitutions during the game. A lot of times it can become, well, we didn't pick the right coach, and then we go back to the stereotypes that are handed down to someone like myself, which is, well, she's female, and she's Black, and she's she was pretty passive. She needed someone else to help her. She wasn't as dominant as we needed her to be when she's having those conversations with officials, or maybe she was too dominant, which then tailors back to that race side. And if you're too dominant, then you're too aggressive, and it's just a whole lot going on there. So when we think about pressure, there's a lot more pressure as a Black female coaching, and it's more along the lines of how we are perceived to be in that space and whether we're good enough, which is why for me it was really important that I wanted to share that I was a chartered professional coach, and I do have my FIBA certification for basketball, obviously, and I have completed my Train to Compete certification, and sharing that I have in education is so important to me, because I think sometimes there needs to be validation as to, did this Black female do what she needed to do in order to be a good coach, which is sometimes overwhelming to think that, I'm in a space where maybe I feel like I need to prove to others that I'm worthy of doing this, and that I will make mistakes, but the mistakes aren't always necessarily due to gender or race. The mistakes are because at that point in time, I was a brand new coach. So again, we're talking about what I would call for myself are hidden pressures. So a lot of times, again, if someone's looking at someone who's a new coach, the assumption is that perhaps they're younger, so we kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, and that it's their first year, and they find the right people around them to support them in that space. But for me, the fear of failure, it weighs quite heavily on me. I know that there have definitely been times where I think an assessment of me as a coach has been significantly more harsh than my male counterparts or my white male counterparts, which you try to go into a space of being that strong Black female, but again, that can be a little bit tiring because you're trying not to show the impact that has when you see that you're being criticized for your coaching based off your gender or your race or a combination of the two. Because a lot of times you don't really hear people who might not be a very good coach and have people say, well, because they're white or because they're a male, they weren't qualified to coach. And I think that also comes to play in work as well. So if we're trying to apply for, if we've gotten a new job, there's a lot of pressure to be successful so that nobody can question what you've done and throw it back as because of your gender or because of the color of your skin. So again, just another chance to reflect. So how many of us have hidden pressures that have then impacted how we reflect on the game? And I think it's important to remember at that point, when I say hidden, there are other pressures that I feel that maybe I don't talk about with other people. So as coaches, I think that that's probably the same for all of us, that there are the hidden pressures around maybe you don't want to, the fear of failure means that you might not be representing your community very well, or where you work, or your family. So anyone who's not a coach, I think when we're yelling at our coaches or our athletes, really reflect on the stuff that we can't see. So the bottom half of the iceberg. So as coaches, do we know that exists with our athletes? So how many of us have taken the time to figure out if those athletes have any hidden pressures? And do we try to understand them? So our hidden pressures for our athletes, again, it could be they could have had a bad day at school. Their family might not be supportive of them in their sport. They could have broken up with whomever they might have been in a relationship with. And how do we truly take the time to talk to our athletes to understand that those things impact how they play or how they interact with their team? When we think about athletes that might be a little bit more quiet, perhaps there's something going on within their life that they might need to build a trusting relationship with a coach in order to have that conversation, as oftentimes coaches are people that athletes or youth trust a little bit more than other adults. I don't know the full detail around that, but I think as coaches, it's critical that we recognize the top part of the iceberg. So what are the things that we can see that might create some negative stereotypes around that athlete, so that when they step on the court, if we're thinking about our Black male athletes, is there a tendency for maybe a technical foul, when I'm thinking about basketball, to be handed out to one of our Black male athletes a little bit faster than maybe his white male counterpart? Is there more, I guess, vulgarity coming from the stands towards our Black male athletes or our Indigenous athletes? Are we really taking the time to realize that, yes, we're playing a basketball game, but the way that our athlete looks can impact how they perceive themselves in that space? And then beyond that, what are all the things that we can't see that we as coaches need to do a better job at trying to understand, so that we can support them in a way that makes them feel like they're safe in our space as a coach and people leading programs and organizations? So I guess everyone's probably wondering, why is this relevant? Very fair question. So I think it's important to remember that all of us have unconscious bias. So I know I'm talking from a space of the biases that I feel are projected onto me. But I also know that I myself have biases towards maybe people that I see or communities where people come from, maybe the age of a coach or the age of an official. And I think as a community, a sport community, that we need to do a better job at figuring out how we can uh, do a better job at trying to change our unconscious bias, which is very challenging. So when I thought through this, I thought about myself as an athlete stepping into a space at a tryout where perhaps there are more white athletes in the gym than there are black athletes. And now the top of my iceberg is glaringly obvious. And I'd be curious to know if that impacted how coaches viewed me when it came to that selection process. So for us at Basketball Nova Scotia, our selection process, we're looking at changing to do a better job at assessing athletes over time as opposed to just over one weekend, because that unconscious bias can be there. And if we make a decision within a 2-week window, that might be based off what our unconscious bias is telling us, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. So how many times have we selected athletes on our teams, or how many times have we selected athletes on our team because we have a bias towards them being better based off what we perceive to be real? And then how many times have we not selected athletes because of a bias that we project it as being negative? So I can definitely say that I've been guilty of that. I don't think it's fair for me to sit here and act as though I've never been in a space where I didn't make a decision based off what I perceived. But I know that it's important that I reflect on that and try to figure out how we can improve. So with our Canada Games team in 2017, I know I had coached a group of athletes for a period of time. I think they were U14. And I coached them for 2 summers and then took a summer off to start my position at Basketball Nova Scotia, and which I was then named the Canada Games coach, which was prior to actually being hired at BNS. And when we were trying to figure out how to select our team, it was critical for me to have other people in that gym that would be able to challenge me in a way that allowed me to assess athletes in a much better light than perhaps I would have if it was just me picking, because my favoritism probably would have come to light knowing full well that there were a number of athletes. There was probably 12 or 14 athletes that I would have coached since they were 14 that were now trying out for this Canada Games team. And if I didn't do my due diligence in bringing other coaches in to better assess those athletes, the makeup of my team probably would have looked more of like 11 athletes that I had coached previously would have possibly made that team. So what we ended up doing was we brought in athlete or coaches from across the province, both male and female, and I was challenged quite a bit, and I know that I pushed back, and I would say things like I've known this athlete for 3 and 4 years, and they're a good person, and I know that this is what they're going to bring to the table, and I've heard that this athlete over here is a little bit maybe doesn't show up on time, and all of those different factors. And ultimately, my team ended up being made of almost equal parts athletes that I had previously coached and athletes that I had never coached before, because of bringing in some other people to challenge the biases that I had. The next question would be, how do our biases impact the way that we treat officials? I'm sure that I've probably said things like, oh, they need glasses, they can't see, based off what I perceive to be the age of that official. I definitely hear it in the stands now. You can hear it when we're talking about our minor officials over at the score tables. Usually they are younger when they're working with, when they're scorekeeping minor games. How often do we assume that they're not paying attention because of their age, or that they're not capable of doing their job because of their age, or they don't care because of their age? And all of those things we project onto them, and then it turns into us yelling things like, you missed the score, get off your phone. You know, we have some people stomping over and telling them that the score is wrong when in fact the score is actually right. So again, the bias towards officials on the court could be based off their age. It could be based off even where they're from. You know, how many times have we assumed that an official is not going to officiate the game fairly because of where they're from, even within our own province? Or when we go to a national championships and all of a sudden there's an official who, if my team from Nova Scotia was playing and all of a sudden there's an official from Nova Scotia on our court to officiate the game, which rarely ever happens. I don't even think it does, to be honest. But if that were to happen, the outside would view that as our Nova Scotia official would have bias towards the success of our provincial team. As you can see, I was typing something and clearly didn't finish typing it or backspacing from that. The next question would be, how does this impact how we treat the other coaching staff? So I know that I've had people bypass me to shake the hand of my assistant coach. I've had officials not look me in the eyes when they shake my hand. I've had minor officials walk past me and go to my assistant coach at the other end of the bench to ask them a question about something on the stat sheet. I've had parents walk into gyms at tryouts and assume that I was not the coach. So how can we do a better job at not always making an assumption that someone who happens to be a white male is the head coach of a team? And I think it's important that we reflect on those moments, because for me, when it happens, there's a lot of frustration and there's a lot of, you know, reflecting on, okay, I'm a chartered professional coach and I did do this certification and I've been coaching for, you know, 14 years. How come I am still assumed to be an assistant, a manager, the wife or the girlfriend of the assistant coach, or I could be perceived as one of the athletes? So those are some of the challenges that I face that I'd like for us to all reflect on as we move away from this conversation. And then, do we consider our biases towards these athletes and the hidden pressures that they face? So even when we're coaching our athletes, do we talk to certain athletes differently? And that could be talking to some of our Black athletes as though they need a lot more help, which is a common stereotype, is that all Black people are struggling financially and grew up in some challenging situations. But again, that's the overall grouping of how our race is perceived sometimes. So when we're coaching our athletes, how do we ensure that our biases are not impacting how we communicate to them? Again, yes, every athlete is to be treated in a way that works for them. I don't think it's fair for us to say that every athlete is treated or spoken to the same, but I do believe that every athlete deserves to be respected regardless of who they are, what they look like, or where they came from. So those are some really big questions for us to think about leaving this. And again, it's hard to change. And again, I know I'm guilty of it, but I think the only way for us to increase the number of females in coaching, visible minorities in coaching, LGBTQ population in coaching, persons with disabilities in coaching, is to do a better job at eliminating our biases so that we can have a more well-rounded coaching staff and a more well-rounded team. So how do we move forward? I'm going to ask everyone to take a bit of time to do a little bit of an exercise here. Shout out to Liz, my mom, for helping me find this. I haven't done it myself yet. We were just talking about it last night, of how we can really challenge the way that that we're functioning as a coach community, and then how we're selecting the athletes that make our team. So what I want everyone to do is write down the initials of the last 3 coaching staff that you've been a part of. So originally the exercise was 10 people who you really trust outside of your family, but because we're talking specifically about coaching, I'd like for everyone to take some time to write those people down. So for me, that would be my time with St. Mary's would be my last coaching staff, and probably my Canada Games team. So for me, I would write down those coaches that I have been a part of. So I'll give everybody about, I don't know, minute or two, maybe. So now what we're going to do is then write down, or I guess check off. So we'll start with some traits that match who you are. So let's say if I was writing down my coaching staff from St. Mary's University, so it would be Scott Monroe, Les Berry, and Laura Langell. The first one that I have here to check off would be age. So how many of those people for me fall into kind of my age category? So I would probably put Laura in there. And then when we move on and we go to, okay, race, for me, I wouldn't be able to check anybody off because I don't look like any of them. If we go to gender, I would put a check next to Laura. So that's kind of what we're going to do. So next to everyone's name, if what I say matches who you are, I want you to check that off next to that person. So check off anybody who is in like the same age range as you. And now let's check off everybody who you worked with who was the same race as you. Check off everybody who is the same sex as you. Everybody who has the same religion, if you know. Everybody who has the same sexual orientation as you, if you happen to know. Everyone that speaks the same language. Everyone that has the same physical ability. Everyone that has the same mental ability. Everyone that has the same education, which would probably be maybe a university degree. And everybody who's in the same geographic location as you. So I obviously cannot see what everybody has. Maybe no one did it. We'll never know. But the object of this was to then reflect on, out of the coaches that you have worked with, how many of them are the same age, race, sex, has the same religion, same sexual orientation, speaks the same language, has the same physical and mental abilities, same education, and lives where you live. So when we think about that, and I think back to addressing the structure of the coaches that we had in selecting our Canada Games team, the intent was to make sure that not everybody in that gym selecting the athletes looked and sounded like me and lived in the same space that I live in, um, which helps me get rid of some of my biases during that specific time frame. And then we think about, how does that impact the way that we coach our athletes? Does it give our athletes space to have a conversation with somebody who might look like them? So if I have a coaching staff of um, all Black females, and I'm coaching a team that has, let's say, a white male on that team, am I giving him a space where he can have a conversation with someone on the coaching staff that he's a little bit more comfortable with? And the answer is probably not. And that's an honest reflection of how I would view that scenario. So how can we do better as coaches in making sure that we start structuring our coaching staff to be more reflective of the population in which we serve? And the same thing would apply for if we're structuring a team within an organization. Are we reflective of the members in which we serve? And in doing that, or in not doing that, are we doing them a disservice? So if we change how we're made up of our coaching staff or the makeup of the people that we work with, can we create a more inclusive environment and do a better job at eliminating a bias towards a certain group? So what can we do? I think the biggest disappointment would be doing nothing, given the conversations that we're all having around the BIPOC population, so Black and Indigenous people of color, and obviously a lot of conversation around equity in sport for women. I think that together as a group of coaches, we need to do a better job of taking the time to get to know people outside of our own in-group, so the people that we associate with, which oftentimes looks and sounds like us and are in usually the same age category with the same education. How do I bring in more people that have different experiences than I do so that I can better work with the athletes that are on my team? So I think after this, we all need to take the time to reflect, myself included. I think we need to take time to have discussions. So those are discussions with your current coaching staff, discussions with your team to ask them if this is something that maybe they've thought about before, discussions within our organizations and on our boards. And then I think the last thing is being open to change, because if we're not open to change, then ultimately we're just going to stay exactly where we are. And this entire almost 45 minutes was all for naught. So let's all be, I guess, a better community, and specifically with our sport community. I think that we're one of the lucky groups that get to work with so many different types of people from so many different walks of life. And oftentimes we leave some people behind because of our own biases towards them and what we see at the top of an iceberg and what we miss with everything else that's underneath what we can see. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Tasia.
Sure.
I know there were so many moments when you shared stories that, like, internally I could feel the pain of my own experiences. So I thank you for sharing those and making us aware of those things. I have a couple questions that I want to ask you about, especially in terms of how you're working with your athletes to kind of become aware of their own hidden pressures, but also to kind of face kind of their own disadvantages. So, like, what skills are you giving them or helping them develop so that they can kind of, I guess, combat the disadvantages?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different things that we can do. And one of the biggest things that we've been talking about with basketball has been creating safe spaces where people can actually have those conversations. I know a lot of times, like I mentioned in the presentation, that coaches are very much, we always say we're people first, right? Before they are athletes. But I think it's critical that we as coaches find the time to have those conversations. If all we do is show up at a practice 5 minutes before and leave 5 minutes after, then I don't think we're doing our full service as a coach. What are we doing? Like with our provincial teams, we practice in the morning and then usually have a 2-hour break and then practice in the afternoon. What are we doing during that time frame to foster a better way of supporting one another and acknowledging each other's differences? Because I think a lot of times when we think about the athletes that we're coaching, they usually go into different pockets, specifically in team sports. You can see them go with, the athletes that grew up in this area or went to that school, and then the athletes that are from this race, or the athletes that are, point guards for us. And how do we as coaches try to create spaces where we're actually interacting with one another so that everybody has the chance to learn? And then I think it's important to have time to have one-on-one, or I guess two-on-one conversations with each individual athlete, where we're not just having conversations around, here's what you can do from a skill perspective to be better, because sometimes they're already skilled enough, they just might have something blocking them, and it could be a pressure, and it could just be someone saying, I was bullied at school and I've been bullied all year and I haven't told anyone, and that's what's stopping me from being an excellent athlete. I have all the skill sets, but there's something that you can't see that's really causing some problems. And again, just mentioning the two-on-one conversation when we talk about safe sport, just ensuring that everybody is aware of when you do have those conversations, it's a sensitive conversation. And anytime you're talking to an athlete, make sure that there are two adults there, preferably two that have completed all their background checks and their certifications. But if not, it's even beneficial to bring in someone that athlete really trusts to have that conversation with as well.
Yes, I know for us, those relationships are so important, but yeah, making sure we have that two deep rule, as we call it.
Right. Perfect. Yeah.
Couple audience questions. One of them, how do you address an opposing coach, manager, or parent who addresses you as, say, the manager or a parent or a role that is not yours?
I think it's changed over time. I know there have been times at St. Mary's where Laura and I have had a good chuckle over it, and we kind of do like the put your hand out and fake air shake, like someone just walked right past you. But I think that there's a little bit of responsibility on the other people that are around you, because again, it can be challenging to always have to be like, no, I'm the coach, I'm the coach, I'm the coach. I think it's really important that that our coaching staff, so if I'm thinking about my Canada Game staff, there was myself and my colleague and friend Jalen Skier, who are both Black women, and I was the head coach and she was the lead assistant coach. And then Scott Monroe, a white male, was like our mentor coach for us, and he actually sat at the end of the bench during all of our times with Canada Games. And the way that he positioned himself was a way to present like, these two are coaching the team, not me. So I think there is definitely a little bit of onus on anyone who has never been in that position to really make sure that we're elevating and highlighting who the head coach is, and always directing them back to them. Because if we start, if an assistant coach starts taking on those conversations with an official or a minor official or someone from the other team, then that cycle will just continue. Well, the assistant coach answered, so they have to be the head coach. I think it's their responsibility as well to say, actually, like, she's over there, go talk to her.
Yes.
But I laugh quite a bit now.
Yeah. I'm going to say, I have learned to laugh for sure. but I know I personally am so grateful when, especially if it's a male and they step and go, actually, she's the head coach. And I think it's
Yeah.
huge, right?
Yeah.
Another audience question. Let me just pull this up here. Do you have advice, any advice for when I run into a situation where someone argues with our coaching staff? Oh, okay, hold on. That someone argues our coaching staff. Oh, okay. So this person works in a sport that's not very racially diverse. So do you have any advice for when I run into a situation that someone argues our coaching staff reflects our membership, therefore there is no need to be diverse?
That's fun. I think that when we talk about diversity, it's also a chance for us to get to meet new people. So even though your coaching staff reflects your membership, and that's the same with Basketball Nova Scotia, like the population base of our Black athletes is low. It's just obviously a sport in which a lot of times African Nova Scotians participate in. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to create a more diverse atmosphere. And I think when we talk about if our membership isn't diverse, why isn't it diverse? Because I think it'd be hard to find places in Canada where there's only one race and one gender. I think they're there. But again, it's how do we make sure that our organization gives them an opportunity to participate? Do we have the right policies in place? Are we going to their communities? That was a conversation that I had on a panel the other night about, how do we, it's open for everyone. Anyone can show up, but usually it's just this type of athlete. And it's, well, can you take your sport and go to a community? Can you offer like a try it program to see if maybe there are people that are interested in that? But I don't think it's fair to just say like our coaching staff reflects our membership, because then there's a problem with what does your membership look like and how do we increase the diversity there? Because there are definitely athletes that look different than everyone else that might already be in that membership.
Yes. Yesterday in our athlete panel, we had a conversation about how it's so much easier when you can see someone that looks like you doing it, right? Like it helps engagement. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I understood that this is another question. I understood that the coaching staff should ideally be reflective of the community/team. How do we ensure this is not leading to segregation?
Can they elaborate on that?
Let's see if they can elaborate. I would guess, yeah. So my initial thought on this is, how do we avoid, like, I think about, we talked about the grouping between players is like, there's certain, we see it with, the first years go together and the fifth years together. So how do we avoid maybe that type of segregation, but when we're looking at race?
On like a coaching staff?
I would say, I think within a team, if we were trying to match the membership with the coaching staff, then can we start grouping into races? We are trying to match the membership with the coaching staff, then. Oh, okay. So if the coaching staff matches the membership, do you think there's danger of segregation happening within the team? Like,
no, I wouldn't say that. So I always use my Canada Games team as an example. So like I indicated, so Jalen and I were both Black women, but we also had athletes on our team that were Indigenous, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Argentina, that were Acadian. So we were all over the place. So I think when we talk about coaches matching membership, it doesn't have to be like exactly the same, if that makes sense. So when we think about diversity, again, I wouldn't want to pick a coaching staff that's like, okay, we need like a Black person and an Indigenous person and someone from the LGBTQ community. I wouldn't look at it from that structure. I think it's just important to look at it as, are we giving the same opportunity to people who wish to coach in that program? And if we're not, is it because of a bias that perhaps we have? So am I not picking someone to coach a basketball team because perhaps they wear a hearing aid? Is that like, am I thinking, well, maybe they wouldn't be able to hear everything as clearly as maybe I perceive they should be able to hear? So when I don't think there would be segregation, and I don't think it's a focus of trying to match the membership exactly with the coaching staff. I just think as a whole, we need to be more open to having a wide range of people. And again, that's including, I'm just looking at my list here, class, education, language. When we're thinking even of Basketball Nova Scotia, we have athletes that speak French, that can speak Arabic. And do we have any coaches that can speak those languages to support those athletes? And if we don't, how can I find a way to bring them in so that athletes can say, oh yeah, I can go and play for Basketball Nova Scotia because they actually have someone that can speak the language that I was born to speak.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
That kind of actually lands to one final question that I have. And it's in terms of the our biases, do you have some tips in terms of how people can start to become aware of their own biases?
Yeah, I think that activity, the circle of trust right away, when my mom pointed it out, I was like, that's really great. Like, I don't think I ever sat down and looked at who have I coached with over the years and what did they look like. I think that trying to identify bias, the first part is realizing that we do have bias. Like I said, we all have it. It's really challenging to just overturn. I don't think that that's something that we can just do, because we're all born and lived in a certain space, and all of who we are is a reflection of what we were taught from a very, very young age. But I think for me, the biggest way that I was able to challenge my own bias was bringing in people that didn't think the same as me and weren't from the same area. I think we had one of our coaches that was in the gym coached primarily male athletes. And I was like, well, how is he, like, male and female athletes, they both play the same sport, but females can't dunk like that. Or I guess some can, but not out here on the East Coast. So I think for me, when I try to figure out how to assess bias, it's understanding that it is there, that I can't be perfect and make it go away, but I can bring in other people to help support me and help identify my own biases, because sometimes you might not be able to see it.
Thank you. Yes. And I think for all of us, it's a matter of that reflection, right? Take a moment.
Yeah.
Time for one more question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. What are some strategies for increasing diversity and promoting inclusion when we may not know exactly why people aren't coming to the table?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that we've talked a lot about at Basketball Nova Scotia. One of the things we're actually talking about, so for us in Halifax, it's Pride Week right now, and we're finalizing our trans inclusion policy. And we were trying to, usually we recognize a celebration that's going on within Canada or within Nova Scotia. And one of the things that we were talking about was that our organization, we can never claim to be flawless in what we do. Like, we still have a lot of things that we need to change, because obviously viewpoints change, and acceptance has changed from what it was. I think it was like 1964 before Black women were able to vote, and now all of a sudden I can go and vote. So there are things that change. So for us to think about what we can do, I think it's more of a long process. We do panels and we share some resources for people to read, but I think there's a lot of work that has to happen, and it has to happen from a higher level. And again, what I learned from a gentleman I was on a panel with the other night was, he talked about going out and recruiting athletes for his hockey team. So he runs a black hockey league, and obviously, when you look at the makeup of hockey, not a lot of Black people play. And he was like, I go out and I recruit. Like, I will find the athlete who I think they should have a chance to play hockey. And I took that and thought about, what about recruiting coaches? Can we go and recruit coaches to make it more diverse? So again, if I think about maybe even women, a lot of times we don't apply for a position because we don't check off every single thing on the job description. But like, we could have 9 of 10 and we're like, better luck next time. I need to go and get that. So sometimes it does take people going out and asking someone to come over and coach, or asking someone to be involved, because it's just a way of creating a place that's inviting. But I do think it comes from the top down. So let's say if Basketball Nova Scotia doesn't have a trans inclusion policy, which we've now implemented, did we have a space for our trans athletes to feel as though they could truly participate in our organization, and feel as though they were accepted and that they were safe, and if they had any problems of discrimination, that they could truly come to our office and we would back them on that. So again, I think we can make a lot of changes on our own, by who we have on our coaching staffs to better pick our rosters. But then that's the same from the top of our organizations. If you think about them as the coaching staff, how do we do a better job at restructuring so that we can better reflect who works in certain spaces, and then the coaches that they select, and ultimately have kind of a trickle down effect. But I would say it's a lot of work to create a space that's inclusive and diverse. But I don't think it's something that we should back down from, because again, you could look at every single one of us on the call, and we all have something entirely different. And it could be the way that we think, it could be the style of our hair, it could be the way we dress, it could be, maybe someone doesn't drive, and that could give a thought process around, if I do practices down an hour away from Halifax, that person could say, well, what about the people that can't drive there? And I know that's something very minimal, but it impacts how we select our athletes. If I say, well, if they can't get there, then, we'll just pick someone else, then that's not fair. That's not being inclusive. So again, a lot of work, and it comes from the top down, but as coaches, I think we can do a lot of work to impact the athletes, and then how we interact with people that make our sports function, how we interact with our custodians, with the managers of facilities, with officials, with the other coach, because as adults that are in sport, our goal is to make sure that our athletes, when they're looking at us, hear us being respectful and inclusive to everyone around us, and not just the people within our own little in-group.
Yes. I admire what you're doing for inclusion. I think it's fantastic to hear that Nova Scotia Basketball is doing that, and I hope that so many other associations, sport organizations are following suit. I'm really proud to be a part of that, and we've had even discussions around different training that we need to have for our coaches, for our provincial coaches, and then hopefully down to our club levels as well, because again, are we preparing our coaches to support our athletes when they face any sort of racism or discrimination? And are we setting them up so that we can have those conversations to see kind of the bottom half of that iceberg and try to get rid of the pressures that they might have on themselves? Well, I know I would be interested in that training, so I'm just going to keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, I don't know what it looks like yet, but that's a promise that I made to an athlete in having some of these discussions around racism. So it will be happening. Yeah.
Which is fantastic and needed for all
Yeah.
of us. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us and educate us, and hopefully get everybody discussing and being open to change, which I think is the most important thing right now. So thank you.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Thank you to everybody for joining. Please remember to go check out the Black Canadian Coaches Association. You will get an email about it. And a reminder that we do have another talk this afternoon where we'll be talking about values-based leadership. So hopefully we'll see some people there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone that tuned in, and feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm always happy to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.